Welcome to the Stray Pointers podcast, where seemingly ordinary people join us for extraordinary discussions. You're watching Season 3, Episode 2 of the Stray Pointers podcast. This episode was originally recorded on January 16th, 2024. The episode was re-released with video on January 29th, 2025. I'm your host, Jim Lawless. For more information about the show, including show notes for this episode, please visit straypointers.com. Tonight, I'd like to welcome writer, editor, technologist, and contrarian Jeff Duntemann. Jeff, welcome to the show.
Well, thanks for having me. Good to be here.
Jeff, we passed a couple of Pascal milestones not too long ago. A few months ago, Turbo Pascal turned 40 years old, if you can believe that.
Oh, I can believe it.
And more recently, we lost Professor Nicolas Wirth, the
Yes.
creator of the Pascal family of technology. I thought it would be a good idea to have a Pascal-themed show, and you were the first person I thought of, which will become evident as we why that is as we get into the discussion here. I thought we'd start. I've read a lot. You know, you've been published a lot, so I know a bit about your background. Could we talk? Could you tell me a little bit about your early interest in electronics and computers?
Well, sure. I became interested in electronics because I was taking a shortcut through an empty lot one day when I was in 6th grade and saw a radio chassis sitting in the dirt. And I thought, wow, what is that? That's a radio with the cover off, goodness. And flipped it over, and there's all these little wires and little things on the wires. So I, basically shook the dirt out of it, took it home, and started cutting parts out of it and trying to figure out what they did. And everything points back to that.
So this was like pulling Excalibur out of the stone for you then.
Pretty much. I'd always been interested in astronomy, but electronics kind of intruded, in part because I could create whole new things using it. Whereas telescopes, you look at stuff that's been around for billions of years, which is good. But there was a craft element, a sort of a hands-on element to electronics that astronomy doesn't have apart from building telescopes. And I went from there quickly into the library and read all the books that they had and started building things.
Now, did any other members of your family have any knowledge of electronics or anybody like that? Any teachers that could help you out?
My father knew a bit about electronics. He was a radio operator during World War II at a weather station somewhere in North Africa. And he helped me build a couple of things when I was just getting started. But in a lot of ways, he was as puzzled by a few things as I was, because he had built a crystal set when he was a kid, and that's as far as he got. Mm-hmm. The other person was my Uncle Louis, my mother's brother, who was sort of like the family eccentric. He's a saint to me, but a lot of my aunts and uncles sort of.
St. Louis, for real?
Yeah, St. Louis, yeah. Meet me down at St. Louis. Well, Uncle Louis gave me stuff, and he gave me stuff that made that first old radio look like small change. He gave me the chassis of an entire late 50s TV set. And there were no tubes in it, but underneath it, my God, this jungle of capacitors and resistors and, all this other stuff. Mm-hmm. And he gave me other things as time went on, including tools. He gave me my first soldering gun. And basically, he didn't teach me much. He lived a long way off. So I didn't spend a lot of time with him, but the material that he gave me to work with was basically priceless.
Now, did you have any classes as you were going into junior high, high school, that sort of thing in electronics?
Um, no, not really. I was self-taught. I binged on library books, and there were lots of books about electronics for teen and tween boys.
Mhm.
You know, there was a whole series, the boys' first book of radio and electronics, the boys' second book of radio electronics. The library had them all. I took them out, read them, took them back, followed the circuits, built the radios. And
So then did you pursue electronics in college?
yes and no. In college, I I took the jump from CB into amateur radio, ham radio, which of course requires you to know a certain amount about electronics, although it's a fairly narrow uh, band of what electronics actually can do. But I got my first amateur radio license while I was a sophomore in college. And it opened a few doors for me because there were other books that told you how to design resonant antennas, how to build a transmitter out of old TV tubes and parts, which I had in a couple of old beer boxes in the garage. And I built my first transmitter. It was a lousy transmitter, but I got some contacts on it, and it solidified my desire to build new things. And that is where electronics took me as I got out of college and took a job with Xerox fixing Xerox machines. And I learned a lot about that. Xerox has an excellent training center that teaches electronics, even though the old machines that I was usually called upon to fix had nothing more electronic in them than a relay or maybe a rectifier. But the training was invaluable, and it took me to the next stage in building things.
Can I ask
And
can I
yeah,
ask real quick, what was your major in college then?
well, I'll freely admit this. I withdrew from engineering school because I knew it was not my calling. And at the time, my father was dying of cancer, and my home life was kind of disturbed, let's say.
Mhm.
So I talked to some of my friends, and my high school locker partner went to DePaul University, and I looked them up and decided to become an English major because then I could be a teacher. I also discovered at the same time period that I could write, that I could explain things. And I wanted to learn more about how one did that. So I majored in, liberal arts, but really I was hoping to become a writer, and that's why I chose the major that I did.
Okay. Okay. I'm sorry, I derailed this a little bit. You were talking about your first gig at Xerox.
Yes.
Um,
Well,
you,
that was, I had a chance to talk to people who were into electronics more than I was
mhm.
because all the repair guys would meet in the morning at a sort of an office filled with spare parts and cleaning supplies and stuff. And we talk about electronics, and that I took that job in 1974. And 1974 was the year that the Altair microcomputer first appeared.
Mhm.
And we were all just, whoa, this is a whole different wrinkle. We're not talking crystal radios anymore.
Mhm.
And my experience at Xerox and the other guys that I worked with there um, led me in the directions of personal computing, but I did it my way. I built my first computer on a piece of perf board that I got at Radio Shack and a hat full of parts that I ordered from some online place. And I built something called a Cosmac Elf,
Oh, sure.
which was published in Popular Electronics in 1976.
Mhm.
They gave the circuit, told you what parts. I had had one high school course in computing, and it was half a year. It was Fortran, so I knew basically what computers were. But the notion of actually having one I mean, at high school, I never saw the computer I was working with because it was downtown.
Mm-hmm.
And, we punched cards in a stack, fed them into the machine, and then 3 hours later, we got back our list of error messages.
So how did you make the jump from Fortran to RCA 1802 assembly language?
In part because I had been dipped thoroughly in electronics, and I had also read a couple of books by a very talented man named Don Lancaster, who had books on the major families of integrated circuits, RTL, TTL, and CMOS. And I bought those books because one of the guys at Xerox recommended, it's like Gus said, you really need to read Don Lancaster, and I did. And it was because of those books that I was able to understand what I was doing. Fortran was an abstraction, whereas the 1802 was signal levels represented by voltages that I could measure with my voltmeter. And so it was nothing short of wonderful. In fact, I never had an assembler. I created binary code in my head and toggled it in with 8 little toggle switches. It was wonderful fun, and it taught me a great deal about the structure of computers and the way that their logic works internally to a degree that I wouldn't have gotten if I had just taken a course, that allowed me to program a PDP-8 or a PDP-11 or something.
Mm-hmm.
So building the computer was the big win with the Cosmac Elf. I didn't do a great deal with it, but I ended up building 3 of them, each one bigger and more complicated than the one before. And the last one had 2,560 bytes of memory wire wrapped onto the perf board. And I built a sketch program. I could actually draw pictures on a coarse, low resolution TV screen. And, it looked like an old Pong game, but in fact, that's what the chip was designed for.
Now, did
But
you was
yeah,
was this basically your last model? Was this looking more like a desktop computer at this point with keyboard?
it had a front panel. It had a front panel that was built out of a broken Xerox machine platen cover, which I dug out of the garbage. And trimmed it up a little bit and used it as a chassis, and had a front panel with LED displays in hexadecimal, and the 8 toggle switches, and even a keypad. And I wrote a little program to read digits off a keypad, so I didn't have to like set 8 bits for every byte that I wanted to toggle into the machine. And so again, it was extremely educational just to get in there and wire wrap the thing myself.
So then what was your first actual desktop computer?
My first desktop computer was a CPM machine, CPM 80. I commissioned it, which I think is what it was, even if we didn't call it that way. I paid a guy who knew this stuff better than I did to put a machine together for me, not out of loose chips, but I specified the mainframe chassis. I specified the keyboard, the screen, and how many ports and what kind. And he put it together, and I paid him for all the parts, and I paid him for his labor. And I had a blazing 1 megahertz 8080 CPM machine, but it ran WordStar.
Sure.
And I had the foresight to buy a tall screen. It wasn't a 4x3, it was like square. And I could get 43 lines on it. And so typing into WordStar kind of made it look a little bit like a photographic negative done in green of a typewritten page. And that was fascinating and very attractive, given that everything prior to that, because I had been writing short stories and articles for a couple of the ham radio magazines on an IBM Selectric.
Mm-hmm.
But now I could write it on a computer and print it out on an employee discount Diablo printer. So I was set. That was 1979 going into 1980.
So aside from Fortran and the various assembly languages, what were your first programming languages then that you used on the CPM box?
Well, the first one I used on the CPM box was BASIC. However, I had a job. I stopped being a repairman and got a job as a data entry operator into a new computer system that tracked failure modes and defects in brand new models of copiers that Xerox put out. And I got to know the guy that wrote the system out in Webster, New York. He wrote it in something called APL, which stands for a programming language. How clever. And he gave me my own APL account on the mainframe. It's like shades of high school, only I don't have to screw with punch cards. And I wrote APL, and I learned a huge lesson doing that. I wrote a 600-line text formatter that justified text into a 5-inch column in APL, 600 lines. By the time I got to the bottom, I couldn't remember how the top part worked. I don't know how familiar you are with APL.
Yeah, to
But it
me,
uses
it's kind of
Greek
a write-only
characters.
language.
It's a write-only language. It's a language only a mathematician would love, and math was never my strongest subject. However, I did learn the basics of what programming in a higher level language can do that went well beyond the kindergarten level Fortran that I learned in high school.
Mhm.
And so my first real programming language that I used for projects was APL. Um, BASIC was the first language that I used on the CPM machine. And that was until 1981 when I paid, I think, 350 bucks for a compiler called Pascal MT Plus. One of my friends said Pascal's a great language. And he had heard me complaining about how unreadable APL is. And he says, you can write Pascal so it almost reads like a book. It's like, I like that. So I bought Pascal MT Plus from a guy named Michael Lehman. I forget where they were, but he and his wife had a business selling this compiler. And I dove in and I did a lot of Pascal in the first couple of years that I was working as a data entry operator. And then I actually got a job at Xerox writing code myself using a couple of in-house languages that I think are best left forgotten and ideally buried in a lead casket. But, I learned the languages, and they weren't the cool stuff like Mesa or
Mhm.
Cedar. They were things that, like I said, are best left forgotten, which they've been. I did learn how to write code in different languages using the Xerox languages, APL. I had a little bit of Fortran. And then I graduated to Pascal and took to it very, very quickly and ran with it as hard as I could.
Now, before Turbo came out, was Pascal MT Plus, was that a fairly popular Pascal compiler for CPM?
Um, yes, in large part because it was one of the few that you could get for Pascal. There were a couple of flavors of UCSD Pascal out there that may have been pirated. I don't know. I wanted it to be a legal thing, so I purchased a product that from a person who I knew was selling it legally, and um, I got it on the recommendation of a friend of mine who had been using Pascal MT Plus, and he thought very highly of it, and very quickly I thought highly of it too. And I thought so highly of it that I started writing a book explaining it. Um, at the time, I was selling articles to a magazine called PC Tech Journal in Baltimore, which was owned by Ziff Davis.
Mhm.
And the tech editor at the magazine who edited the articles that I wrote for them said, Jeff, you're pretty good at this. I bet you could write a book. And if you could write a book on this, I can refer you to an editor at my publisher. She had a book contract with Scott Forsman outside Chicago. And So I finished the book on Pascal MT Plus, took it next time I got out to Chicago to see my sister and the relatives, went down to Scott Forsman, handed him the proposal. He read through it. The next day I had a contract. And I was just delighted. I'd written a book and I'd sold it to the first place I took it to and got a $5,000 advance. Holy Moses. That was middling money in 1983.
Sure.
So I turned it in and they paid me my advance and they gave it to their editor. And the editor said, "This is a great book, Jeff, but," and I said, "Yes, I know. Turbo Pascal is taking over." And yes, it was. I bought Turbo Pascal as soon as it came out. And I realized that MT Plus is pretty good. Turbo Pascal was better and it would reach more people because it only cost $50. I paid $350, which in modern dollars is over $1,000 for MT Plus. And Turbo could do everything it could do and other things as well. So the other complication. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Did they let you keep your advance?
Oh yeah.
Great.
Because, well, I'll tell you why they let me keep the advance. My editor said, "How much work would it be to go back to your book and rewrite it to cover Turbo Pascal?" It's like, holy Moses, I have no idea. But I said, "Hey, no problem." And so I went back home, and 6 months later, I had a Turbo Pascal book instead of a Pascal MT Plus book. Sent it to my editor, and he said, "This is great. We're going to publish it as soon as we can." And it took another 1.5 years for them to publish the damn thing. I don't know why. But eventually it came out in the middle of 1985. And that was Complete Turbo Pascal, my first book. Sold a lot of copies, went through 3 editions, and I'm quite happy with the way it turned out.
Okay, so you first entered my radar on a magazine that was, excuse me, that was the house magazine at Borland called Turbo Techniques.
Yep.
At that time you buy one of the products. I think it might have I'm not sure if Turbo C was quite out yet at the time. I think it was Turbo Pascal was their primary product and a couple of libraries for it, but
they had Turbo Prologue too.
They did at the time frame I'm thinking of, though. I think Pascal was really their bread and butter, and then the indexed file library and some other library they had for it. And if you bought Turbo Pascal, you had like a 3 or 4 issue subscription or something like that to.
Well, you had to turn in a card. You had to register the product. If you registered Turbo Pascal or Turbo C or whatever it was that you had, you would get a year's subscription to the magazine. And that's how it worked. I took that job in February of 1987. And I left Ziff Davis in January, and then took the Borland job, and I created a magazine for him called Turbo Techniques. And Philippe Kahn, who of course ran Borland, had a set of specs. He wanted it to be bigger than Dr. Dobbs Journal. And I said, "That's a lot of pages." "Well, we can do it." Like, well, yeah, I can fill that many pages, but I'm not sure how many pages of ads we're going to sell. Are you going to sell ads to your competitors? And he says, "Oh, sure, why not?" Well, sure. The story compressed meant that we published 6 issues of Turbo Techniques, and everybody loved it. But in each issue, we sold 15 or 17 pages of ads, which was nowhere near enough to pay for what eventually, I believe the final press run we did was 217,000 magazines, because they promised anybody who registers Turbo Pascal or whatever others they had at that time, I'm pretty sure they had Turbo C, will get a year of the magazine for free. And I did exactly what I was told. And after a year, somebody was doing spreadsheets and decided this was a money black hole. We don't want to do this anymore. So they canceled the magazine, sent us all home. And it was one of the most fun I've ever had making money, putting magazines together.
Now, shortly after that, you were back on my radar at Dr. Dobbs Journal
Yes,
in a column of your own called Structured Programming.
I
How did that
was.
happen?
There was another gentleman, and I think I'm having a 70s moment here. I don't remember his name, but he was doing the structured programming column.
Was
And
it Kent Porter at the time?
Kent Porter, yes.
Mhm.
Kent Porter pitched another column to John Erickson, who was running the magazine, Dr. Dobbs at the time. And that left nobody to do structured programming. So John Erickson, who had been very aware of Turbo Techniques, looked me up and asked me if I would do the gig. And this was in 1988, late 88. I don't think the first column appeared until early 89. But I covered Pascal and Modula 2 almost exclusively and wrote the column for 4 years, paid my mortgage with it. And because he was paying me $1,200 a month. And that was quite a chunk of money in 1989
Sure.
and the early 90s. So I was happy I got to do, I imitated Isaac Asimov, who I had scads of his nonfiction books. He wrote every article starting with a funny story. So I decided to start with something, I don't know whose expression it was, but I heard somebody say, bring him in grinning. And I did my best to do that. And the column was very popular.
Yeah,
And
my coworkers and I used to discuss the column each month. It was a very enjoyable column. We were all coding in C at the time for MS-DOS,
yeah,
but we all had kind of started with Pascal. We all had Turbo Pascal at home and things like that. We all enjoyed the column a great deal. So here's a bit of trivia for you. There's no way you could possibly know this, but would you hazard a guess at which of your columns is my favorite?
um, well, the one I hear most about was what is this interrupt really for? Which started out with the Pizza Pride girl. And I forget what it was about interrupt service routines. And I started out with a funny story about the catering truck that rolled into our parking lot every day at 10 o'clock. And a girl came out of a pizza supplies broker. I don't know what they sold. And she wore something different and very provocative every day. So whenever they rolled in, everybody in the office, I shouldn't say everybody, the males in the office ran out onto the balcony to look down and see what the Pizza Pride girl was wearing today. It interrupted our day. So what was this interrupt really about? Let's talk about PC interrupts.
Okay, that I vaguely remember that. Now I'm going to have to go back and see if I have that archived here somewhere. But the one that was actually my favorite, the one that for some reason sticks in my memory, is your article on Zeller's congruence and the
Oh, yeah.
discovery that the modulo operator in the Pascal family of languages behaves different than the modulo operator in the C curly brace family of programming languages.
Yep.
And I thought that was a monumental discovery. And I thought that should have been touted a lot more. And, Dr. Dobbs had it had a high readership, but I just thought that your name should have been noted somewhere on this discovery. And this should have been in every C and every Pascal textbook from there on, that, the modulo operator doesn't work quite the same way in Pascal and C, but I never saw it mentioned after that.
Huh. Well, I didn't think that much of it. I thought, the programming universe is crawling with bugs, and I just happened to find another one. Because I didn't have a broad experience in programming, I didn't know how important that particular bug happened to be.
Now,
So
was that actually a bug or was it an intended behavior?
I'm pretty sure Pascal did it correctly. Now, keep in mind that was 35 years ago.
Mhm.
Um, and I don't remember all the details. I'd have to go and dig up the big Dr. Dobbs fat book, like a Sears catalog that has all my columns in it
Mhm.
and everything else, and look up that column again. Unfortunately, I don't have um, the word processor files for the Dobbs columns anymore. I don't remember what happened to them, but I don't have them.
Did they ever, I know they collected some of the columns of some of the other authors, like they had collected Sea Chest into Sea Chest and Other Treasures
Yeah.
and books like that with Alan Holub's column. Did they do the same thing for structured programming?
No. And I didn't know about Alan's book until long after the fact. Um, Remember that I started a new publishing company here in Arizona in 1990, and that took a lot of work. And eventually I had to tell John Erickson that we're starting to publish books and a magazine, so I have to retire the column because I can't do it all.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why I stopped writing the Dobbs column. Uh, John understood, but he really said, "You will be missed." And he was one of the best editors I've ever had.
Okay, so you've completed your run at Dr. Dobbs Journal, and now you've formed. Did you call it the Coriolis Group at the time?
It was incorporated as the Coriolis Group, and our logo was a spiral galaxy because it sort of reminded people of the Coriolis effect. And I got the name because the volume name for the hard drive on my PC at home was Coriolis. I'm not sure why, but I said, hey, let's name the company after my hard drive. And it stuck. And we worked real hard, but we got a magazine out, PC Techniques. I wonder where that name came from. Um, and in 1994, we started publishing original books. We had done some packaging of books for John Wiley and Company out of New York City, but it wasn't until 1994 that we published the first top to bottom Coriolis book. And um, we we succeeded, and we found that we were making far more money off the books we published than the magazine. We kept the magazine going because we used to sell our books out of ads, full page ads in the back of the magazine, which was
Sure.
quick cash.
Mm-hmm.
But toward the end, it was a little hard to justify um, the expense of the magazine, uh, given how small a part of the big picture it actually was. So we closed the magazine down in March of 2000
Okay,
after a
so
10-year, 60 issue run.
so what was happening then at this time was Microsoft came out with Visual Basic, which was
Yes.
kind of taking the developer world and the amateur developer world by storm too, because now there was this rapid application development tool. Borland countered with their own
Delphi.
product, yeah, Delphi, and your magazines, PC Techniques and Visual Developer, those sort of catered still to the Pascal family of technology, did they not?
I leaned them in that direction because A, that was what I knew, and B, is because I didn't want C to take over all of the world. We did articles on C. We did a lot of articles on C. But Pascal, I had a Pascal column. I mean, I didn't, but I had a guy doing a Pascal column, and we had a lot of Pascal articles. And we tried to keep it sort of on an even keel. But like you said, in 1997, 96, we changed the name of the magazine to Visual Developer because I could see which way the wind was blowing. And between Delphi and Visual Basic, it was changing the whole nature, not only of the industry, but of programming itself.
So
From
we
the old mainframe style programming from top to bottom, it was now kind of a stimulus response, user hits a key, an event jumps up, and an event handler executes code to deal with that keystroke. So
were you using Delphi as a product at the time?
um,
Writing any of your own code?
I was writing a lot of my own code. I wrote an early bookmark manager database in Delphi, and a handful of other things. Most of it was exploratory. I was teaching myself by doing, as I've been doing since I found that dirty old radio in an empty lot. And I did write one thing in Turbo Pascal a little earlier, but not much earlier. It had to be text mode, so I wrote it in Turbo Pascal 5.5, and it was a mortgage calculator that was sold by a company that did what they call kioskware, which is basically spin rack software.
Mm-hmm.
For $5, you got a 5.25-inch disc with a program on it and a little tiny book that said how it worked. I wrote a mortgage calculator and it blew the doors off. The program was only $5, and I think I got 75 cents a copy. And that thing sold immense numbers of copies, mostly to real estate agents. And I made quite a bit of money off that thing. And eventually the company went out of business. I don't know what happened, but they reverted rights and it went away. But I wrote a commercial product in Turbo Pascal 5.5 using objects and the Turbo Vision application framework, which was text mode, but it was very similar to the VCL that Delphi used. It was an application framework.
Okay, so Visual Developers kind of run its course. How long did you continue publishing books? Are you still publishing books under Coriolis?
Oh, no. The company went under. Bad things started happening when the dot-com bubble busted in the spring of 2000. We used to sell pallet loads of books to the very large companies, IBM, Microsoft, Oracle, and it was quick cash. In other words, they paid net 30. The bookstore chains typically paid, believe it or not, net 180. It took 6 months to get all of our money from the bookstores. So if IBM is going to buy a pallet load of books and send us a check 30 days later, we loved it. But unfortunately, it cut into our sales, and cash flow is important in publishing, and we had to be very careful so that we would be liquid enough to make payroll. And so it was a bouncy couple of years, but things didn't improve. And then 9/11 happened, and all of a sudden, the country was in a panic. They thought we were going to war. People stopped buying stuff, including books. And so we had no choice but to shut the company down. And our last day of operation was Good Friday of 2003. I'm sorry, 2002. And I miss it. It was a huge amount of work, but it was wonderful fun. And boy, did I learn stuff. Wow.
So can we talk a little bit about Professor Weert and Pascal's impact on computing, in your opinion?
Oh, sure.
What kind of a mark did Weert leave on computing?
He designed Pascal and Modula 2 and Modula 3 and Oberon. But really what he did is he wrote a couple of books that helped us think in Pascal and solve problems in Pascal. The book wasn't about, for loops and do while and all this other stuff. Algorithms plus data structures equals programs. And that book was brilliant. And that was the book that taught me how to write actual good size, complicated, useful programs in Pascal. And I was able to apply that knowledge to the new paradigm of object-oriented programming, which Weert did not cover in his books, or his languages did not have it. That came later, from Turbo Pascal and their 5.5 release, and eventually everybody did it, but Delphi was fully object oriented. So Veert wrote a very accessible book on how to think about the programming challenge. And that's algorithms plus data structures equals programs. I got it right on my big bookshelf here, even though I bought it like 40 odd years ago. It remains one of my favorite books on the programming challenge.
So do you think there's something missing with contemporary computing education now that they really largely don't teach Pascal anymore?
Well, that's a hard question because computer science programs ideally train people to have skills that are applicable in the working world. In other words, they want to make sure that they give you the stuff you need to know before you graduate with a bachelor's or a master's and then go job hunting. An awful lot of modern programming is done in C and C++, Python, but that was very, very much more recently. And so Pascal was used, I think, in, like CS 103 courses where they're trying to teach the students what a for loop is, and how Boolean operators work, that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
But once you got into CS 105, boom, it's in a different language. It's C++. And, there are all these other languages that have happened in the last 10 or 15 years. The only one I respect to any extent is Rust. That's a whole different discussion. Pascal is not often used as a teaching language anymore. However, I am surprised at how many companies use Delphi still today in 2023 to develop commercial products. So
I know that you have a free book that you make available for the FreePascal compiler.
Yes.
Which is at the heart of a Delphi work-alike called Lazarus.
Yes.
What do you think of the the modern Pascal cult popularity?
Well, it's a small cult, but it's definitely a cult. I've been using Lazarus and FreePascal now for 15 years or so, and I've been following its development and its maturity. They just released version 3 of Lazarus, and Delphi, the commercial product from Embarcadero, costs over $1,000.
Mm-hmm.
Lazarus and FreePascal, well, they're free. So if I'm going to teach programming to newcomers, I can't say, well, the first thing you got to do is go pay $1,000 for Delphi. I love Delphi. I've used it a lot, but it's off the table for what I do best, which is explaining how things work. And for that, I use FreePascal and Lazarus, and anybody can go download it. And the book you mentioned, my FreePascal from Square One book, is really a distillation of my Turbo Pascal books from the 4 editions that book went through, with changes whatever were necessary to cover the Lazarus IDE and the GUI builder and the FreePascal compiler itself. So I massaged the old material into a new book and put it out there as a free PDF. And it's still free. It's going to always be free, and so is the compiler. And a lot of people are having a lot of fun with it and are creating some wonderful programs with it. And I'm very pleased to be in on that and have been in on it since before the version 1 release came out. So I've been following this thing practically since it was originally called Megiddo. And they changed that to Lazarus and got serious about it. And the rest, as they say, is history.
That's very interesting. You know, I would not have expected you to call out Rust as a more modern language that that you think has some value. I had seen a comment, I think, that I attribute to you, where you had some accolades for C sharp, and I can see that. Rust just seems to be uh, somewhat divergent from the family of languages that I picture you espousing.
Yes, and I don't intend to program in it. However, I bought a couple books on it because I had my spidey senses were tingling, and I thought this is not just another C clone. This language adds into the C language what it should have had in the beginning, which is memory protection on a very large scale. A great deal of the problems we have with exploits and malware have to do with shortcomings in the C and C++ languages. Rust was created to make a program written in Rust, and you can mix Rust with C++ or C, more resistant to exploitation, which is one of the biggest problems that we as an industry face. And from what I understand about memory, and because of my assembly experience, I know a lot about memory. They're doing a real good job, and whoever designed that thing deserves an Emmy Award or something. Maybe a
Great.
Purple Heart, I don't know.
Great. Well, that was a bit of a surprise when you mentioned that.
It's all
So,
about memory and exploits, which I mean, everybody gets stung once in a while. I've been stung more than once. And this could be a quantum leap in especially operating system um, reliability and uh, just security.
so Jeff, we've talked about your publications around the Turbo Techniques, Dr. Dobbs, Coriolis era, but there's a couple of other areas that I wanted to hit on in no particular order. I know that you're also a sci-fi author who has had a Hugo nominated story and two stories. And I know that I think you had touched upon this earlier in our discussion, but you used to write a bit for amateur radio magazines too, as well, did you not?
Yes.
Can you touch upon those experiences?
Well, the ham radio part of it was short-lived. Once I had my own computer and I started writing articles about the Cosmac Elf, sold them to, I had an article in Byte Magazine, Creative Computing, and that pretty much put ham radio in its dust, at least on the writing side. I still had a station, I still got on the air, but I didn't write much about it after I built my first computer in 1976. And, I found programming to be a compelling exercise of my abilities to explain, which is probably my biggest single talent, is that I can make something complicated accessible to beginners in the field. And it sounds like bragging, but I've been told that in fan letters that I've gotten down the years, especially for my assembly books, which took what amounts to one of the most difficult languages to learn. And I treated it as a programmer's first language. Even if you've never programmed in anything else, let's start out in assembly. And people thought I was stark raving nuts. 500,000 books later, maybe not so nuts. The book works.
Now you still sell assembly language from Square One, a Linux edition, do you not?
It's not from square one. It's assembly language step by step.
Step by step, I'm
The
sorry.
first assembly book I wrote for a different publisher was called Assembly Language from Square One. It's a little known rule in publishing that when you take a book to another publisher, because Scott Forsman got engulfed and devoured by HarperCollins and shut down their computer line, they have to change the name of the book so that retailers will not send the wrong books for refunds. So Wiley said, we can't call it assembly step-by-step anymore. It's got to be something else. And they came up with, I'm sorry, from square one, they came up with assembly language step-by-step. And that's what it's been since the first Wiley edition came out in 1992.
But
And
you have one oriented toward Linux, if I'm not mistaken. Do you know?
well, yes, the first two editions were mostly focused on DOS.
Mhm.
The second edition covered DOS and Linux. The third edition, I threw DOS overboard because that was the 2009 edition. And by then, you know, we didn't do DOS programming the same way we used to anymore. It was all Windows now. So starting with the third edition in 2009, it was Linux only across the board.
Now, is this still kept up? I mean, is this still a book that you update and that sort of thing?
Yeah, I just the fourth edition of assembly language step by step, which is now called X64 assembly language step by step. It is 64 bits. 16 and 32 is treated as historical background, but all the code and the bulk of the explanations focus on the 64-bit architectures from Intel and AMD. The new edition, the fourth edition, came out in mid-October of last year. So it's only been on the streets now for about 3-4 months, but it's selling very well, and I'm getting fan mail, so it's out there doing the job.
Now, which publisher is publishing this?
Oh, it's still John Wiley.
Okay.
They've done the last 4 editions. Scott Forsman did the very first one that came out in 1990. That didn't have a very long life. They shut the line down, and I got all the rights back. It was out there for a year and a half.
Okay. Now, you also write fiction.
Yes, I do.
When did this come into your history?
When I was 8 years old, I wrote a story in, I don't know, I don't call it longhand because we didn't do cursive in 3rd grade, but I wrote a story about my stuffed dogs building a spaceship and going to the moon. And I called it Mutts to the Moon. And I wrote it, I gave it to my grandmother, and she loved it. She passed it around to some of her siblings and nieces and nephews. And I became known as Sade's grandson who writes. But my fiction career didn't start until 1973. I attended something called the Clarion Science Fiction and Fantasy Workshop in the summer of 1973 in Ann Arbor, Michigan, which was a group of 25 mostly young men and women studying under some pretty big names at the time, like Theodore Sturgeon, Harlan Ellison. We had a guest lecture by Harry Stubbs. What was his? Hal Clement. And Ben Bova from Analog Magazine. He was there for a week. Kate Wilhelm. It was intense. But when I came out of there, I felt like I knew what I was doing. And I took one of the stories I wrote at the workshop, cleaned it up, according to Writer's Digest guidelines, which, you know, I bought the book, sent it to Harry Harrison for his anthology, Nova 4. And he sent me back a note, said, I'd like you to clean up a little bit on page, etc. You know, he told me what he wanted me to change. And he said, if you change that stuff, I'll buy it. I changed the stuff. I sent it to him. He sent me a contract, sent back the contract. I got a check for $195. That was my first story, and it was not my last. On the other hand, when I hit the big time in computer publishing, my science fiction output fell off radically in the early 80s. And it wasn't until the 90s that I came back. I had 2 stories on the Hugo Award ballot, but they didn't win. but they were on the final ballot. And not everybody gets to do that. But I started writing a novel in 1997. I had the time because we had grown so big that I now had staff. I didn't have to do every last little bit of it myself.
Mhm.
And so I delegated whatever I could, and I had a little free time after work. And I wrote a novel called No Way in Hell. And one of my friends said, Jeff, I worked in a library once and they won't, I'm sorry, a bookstore, and they won't shelve a book if it has the word hell in the title. Huh? Okay, then I happen to have a couple books with hell in the title. Granted, they're historical theology, but
Mhm.
I changed the name of the book to The Cunning Blood. And it was my first novel. It got rejected by all the biggies, Tor and Aspect, which I don't think exists anymore, and DAW. So I sold it to a small press for $750 and then started writing more. But the book actually got legs. It got reviewed very favorably in a couple of very important places like Instapundit. And we blew through the first 1,000 copies. I wouldn't say overnight, but we sold through, and instead of reprinting the book, they gave me the rights back saying, we're not going to, basically they were saying we are going out of business.
Mhm.
And I don't want to embarrass them by naming them here, but that was okay because by then I had mastered the art of creating ebooks and paperbacks to be published first by lulu.com and later by Amazon.
Mhm.
And I released The Cunning Blood as a paperback and as an ebook, and it's been my bestseller now ever since I put it out, 10 years ago.
Wow, that's great.
But I've written several novels. I have 2 short story collections and a couple of odds and ends.
So
Uh,
what does Jeff Duntemann do now?
um, well, I'm 71. I don't do as much as I used to per unit time, but I write science fiction. In fact, I was writing a chapter on my work in progress, The Everything Machine, this afternoon. Finished another chapter. I'm closing in on the end of the book, and uh, I've really been writing novels to the exclusion of short stories, just because novels are, they're bigger, they sell better. You have to collect a bunch of stories into a book to get anybody to read them.
Mhm.
So I've been writing novels. I wrote 2 fantasy novels, 2 short SF novels, in addition to The Cunning Blood. And I'm now working on a full-size science fiction novel, which takes place in the same universe as The Cunning Blood and has some of the same concepts. And I'm hoping to get that thing finished by the end of March, if not sooner. We'll see. But I also program. I take my telescope, the same telescope I built when I was a high school freshman, out to look at the planets. And I read a lot. If I didn't read, I wouldn't write. Let's
Mhm.
put it that way. And I build things. I have a workshop. I have an engine lathe, and I have all kinds of power tools and stuff. And I've built robots, and uh, I still, every once in a while, I throw a radio together just for old time's sake. I've got all the electronic parts that I got from Uncle Louie and dug out of old TV chassis on garbage day. It's all there. And I go out there and I use my hands and build something. That's important to me. Everything else I do is kind of intellectual, but I still like to get my hands dirty and build something that I can then use and demonstrate and learn from.
Well, Jeff, thank you for joining us tonight. This has really been a pleasure. Uh, I've read your works for decades, and it's been very nice to chat with you this evening. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for the pleasure of having me here. This has been wonderful.
Take care.
You bet.
Thank you all for watching today's show. Let's do this again soon. Take care.